Welcome to the Aaron Harber Show. This is part one of our special two-part series with General Douglas Lute. Doug, thanks for joining me.
It's good to be here. Thanks.
Hey, my pleasure. Of course, you're a former U.S. permanent representative to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
So more simple language, I was the U.S. ambassador to NATO,
right?
Because the formal term is permanent representative because the treaty calls for every member nation to have someone permanently at the headquarters for decision-making purposes. So that's how it became sort of a formal title.
Okay, so I can call you General, I can call you Ambassador.
Let's try Doug.
Okay, I appreciate that. Of course, you retired from the Army as Lieutenant General. You were the former assistant to President George W. Bush. And you were also a former U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor as well. And of course, we want to talk a little bit about Iraq and Afghanistan. Currently president of Cambridge Global Advisors.
Right.
So you're keeping busy.
I am.
All right, so I'm going to ask you kind of a big question. If you could make one change in the United States today, what would it be?
You know, I think the change I would make is to have people remember what America looked like when it was great. There's a lot of talk today about let's be great again, right? Maybe it's useful to think about what was it like when we were really great? So I've launched on a bit of a personal project, and I'm reading histories of accomplishments that I consider indicative of when America was great. So the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, bipartisan effort right after the Civil War, linked America east-west after the repair work after the Civil War, north-south. Big idea. Great, right? And really opened the West. That was a great achievement. The building of the Panama Canal, the Marshall Plan after World War II, the creation of NATO, the most durable, successful alliance in the history, I think, of the world, the Manhattan Project. So these are vignettes of greatness. And so I think rather than imagining that there's something out there waiting for us, it might be useful for Americans to remember some of the times when we were really great, when we achieved greatness. And maybe we'd regain some of our self-confidence.
So besides remembering greatness, on a global scale, what would you like to see change? If you could wave a magic wand, what would you change globally that you think would make the biggest difference?
So look, I think American grand strategy, so global strategy, since we became a world power, so certainly at the beginning of the 20th century, and then on now into the 21st century, has all hinged on one dynamic, and that is our relationships abroad. So certainly our NATO allies in Western Europe, but also that constellation of close treaty allies in Asia. So Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. So if I had one thing I would change, it would be to reinvigorate the health of these alliance relationships. Because as we look forward and imagine the next 20 years of our lives is being dominated by a competition with China, I would much rather go into that competition, not one-on-one, but with the unfair advantage in our favor of having all these allies on our side. So that would be the one thing I'd change.
So speaking of that, how do you think America's position in the world in the last 3 years has changed?
Well, I think as America has become more introspective, and certainly this administration has been dominant in that regard. This is the whole notion of greatness and the notion that somehow the world outside America has taken advantage of America. We've been used, right? We've been fooled. Maybe we've been disregarding and rather carefree and too generous, altruistic to the outside world. I think that one of the things that we should do is remember that the world order, the institutions that we set up, our parents, and in some cases for your younger viewers, their grandparents set up in the wake of World War II, right? That those institutions, so the UN, NATO, the IMF, the World Bank, We're all set up with the aim of not being sort of generous and altruistic to others, but rather they were set up in our own self-interest. So I think it's important that we remember that these things were not designed to just give away America's wealth, but rather to preserve and enlarge America's wealth. So the self-interested part of this gets lost in the current debate. And I think this is something we as Americans should remember.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email info@harbertv.com.
The Hal Broadcaster of the Year Award recognizes an individual who, through leadership, skill, and dedication, is advancing the broadcast industry in our state and our nation. Tonight, we honor Aaron Harber. Aaron has worked extensively in the media as a host, producer, political and economic commentator, and columnist. Today, the Aaron Harber Show is the focus of his media involvement. Aaron, it is a privilege to present you with the Hal Broadcaster of the Year Award. Congratulations.
Just make journalism great again.
The Aaron Harber Show may be viewed 24/7 at no charge from any location in the world at harbertv.com.
You know, certainly in reference to what you said about the current administration, how do some of our most important allies view us today, and do they view us differently than they did a few years ago?
They do. I mean, you know, as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm former U.S. ambassador to NATO, so I would walk the hallways every day, every working day with our, at that time, 27 or 28 Democratic allies. And one of the things that kept NATO together and was reflected in those hallways of NATO was the confidence that those allies had in American leadership. And what's different today is that that confidence has taken a hit. There's a lack of confidence. There's a lack of reliability in this administration in particular, and to be quite blunt, in this White House. Actually, I would argue that in many cases, the State Department, the Defense Department, the intelligence community has pretty much moved along in traditional ways and maintained their close ties with our key allies. Not so with the White House. The White House has proven itself unpredictable, and therefore the confidence in American leadership has eroded. And for some of these allies, so imagine the small Baltic states, which have land borders with Russia, were former Soviet socialist republics, so they know what it's like to live under the heavy fist of Russian domination, Soviet domination. They're now NATO allies. Well, for them, their freedom, the very existence of them as states, and not part of the Soviet Union, right, rests in American leadership. So when there's a dent, when there's a hint that they can't rely on American leadership, an American commitment to NATO in that case, right, that's a very serious matter. And so we're looked at differently around the world.
What would happen, do you think, if Russia attempted to take over one of those states?
I think that among the brightest red lines not to be crossed in the whole global structure is the red line that's represented by the NATO treaty, which is essentially in the 5th article, so Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which goes all the way back to 1949, right? Article 5 says that an attack on one NATO ally will be considered by the others as an attack on all, right? So I think that red line, that line in the sand is crystal clear. It's a treaty obligation, and I believe the Russians will not attempt that sort of traditional ground attack. Not something like, for example, what they're doing in eastern Ukraine today. Ukraine's not a NATO ally. So you can see a pretty stark difference here between what's going on outside of NATO and what's going on inside NATO itself. Now, having said that, let me just expand. That doesn't mean that Russia won't use means short of armed attack to try to create confusion or try to erode democratic systems inside NATO allies. And here in America, this should come as no surprise to us because we now know that in 2016, Russia tried to do that here in America as well. So democracy is fair game these days with regard to Russian and probably Chinese and other external influencers who would rather erode our system and gridlock our democracies by internal problems rather than traditional external attack. So the game has changed a little.
And I want to talk more about that, but as far as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is concerned, what is the status of NATO today, do you think, given certainly some of the comments, statements the President has made, and kind of that conflict where you have a White House with a leader who clearly is not enthralled with NATO, yet, as you said, if you look at how the Department of Defense has proceeded, if you look how, for the most part, the State Department has proceeded, they've proceeded kind of without regard to a number of the President's statements. So where is NATO today? Where is it headed? And where is it headed if the President gets reelected?
Okay, so I think the health of the alliance today is actually at risk. I just finished, one of the things I do is work as a senior fellow up at Harvard University, as an adjunct out of the Kennedy School of Government in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I just finished a 6-month project trying to answer that question. So what is the health of the alliance? The title of the report, it's a 50, 60-page report. I won't summarize the whole report, but the title is telling. NATO at 70, just passed its 70th anniversary in April, an alliance in crisis. And the first challenge that we list in the report, allowing us to pass judgment that it's in crisis, right? The first judgment is the absence of reliable American leadership. But it faces other challenges too. So even if President Trump were a more traditional alliance leader, the alliance faces challenges from inside. So for example, some of its democracies are slipping from, some of its member states are slipping from those democratic values which have underpinned the alliance for 70 years and allowed the alliance to persist for 70 years, right? So if you look at Mr. Orban's Hungary today, Mr. Kaczynski's Poland, you look at some of the moves today, some of the political moves in Italy, the rise of Marie Le Pen's party in France, you can see that we are drifting a bit from those 3 core values of the alliance. So that's a very serious internal crisis, challenge that the alliance must face. Externally, Russia is still there. It's not the Soviet Union, so this is not the Cold War, but Russia's still there. It's using new tactics today, which are sophisticated and deliberately designed to stay below the definition of Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. So Russia's still a challenge. And increasingly, China. Now, you might say, well, wait a second. The N and the A in NATO is North Atlantic Treaty Organization, right? Connecting Europe and North America. What's China got to do with that? Well, China, by way of its Belt and Road Initiative, is buying up commercial transportation infrastructure and communications infrastructure. Most recently, big drama about 5G and the Chinese Huawei firm that is moving into the European marketplace. And they're doing that in part for commercial interests, which is all very understandable. This is an open marketplace, right? But the Chinese model is a little different because commercial interests eventually lead to political payoff. So they're making, in part, these commercial investments with the aim downstream to have political payoffs. So I think one of the things NATO needs to do, even though China's a long way from Europe, is to wake up to the buying up of influence on the periphery of Europe, and then ask our European allies and the European Union as an institution should be asking itself, is this healthy? For us to sell the Greek port of Piraeus, for example, one of the major shipping ports in the Mediterranean, is now owned by the Chinese. Is that really where we want to be as Europe? And I think the answer is clearly no, it's not.
There have been some calls, including by the French president, for the creation of a European army. What's your take on that?
Well, if they get started now, about 20 years from now, with dedicated investments, we might have something that you could call a European army. The thing that has melded the European national armies together so effectively since World War II is NATO. So the challenge, I think, as Europe wants to invest in its own defense capacity, is not to replicate or duplicate NATO, but to add on, to supplement NATO. So I'm skeptical that we'll, in the near term, anything like the next couple decades, actually see an independent European capability. And what I really hope is that as the Europeans increase their defense spending, that they use it on capabilities that NATO and Europe need.
What do you think NATO's response would be if the United States decided to engage Iran in any way militarily?
Well, I hate to get into hypotheticals because, I could now ask you, well, wait a second, define the scenario by answering the following 10 questions, right? So rather than jump into that, I think, first of all, NATO would not have a treaty obligation to move alongside the U.S. in a military operation in the Middle East. So, for example, not all NATO allies were part of the U.S. operations in Iraq beginning in 2003. Some were, the British, the Poles, and so forth, but many were not. Many were opposed, the French and the Germans. So I don't see a NATO operation alongside the U.S. In the case of Iran. Now, if Iran attacks with its ballistic missile force, which is quite substantial, if it attacks a NATO ally, then that's a different matter. I could see a coalition of independent, separate NATO nations
and other nations
joining the U.S. in a coalition. But I don't think NATO as an alliance would react unless NATO were attacked.
What about in terms of international relations and treaties, your take on the president's effort in putting into process our departure from the Paris Climate Accords?
So the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Accords was the first warning shot, pretty significant warning shot, of this administration, very early in this administration, that the obligations and commitments made previously were at risk. And at first it was very disorienting to our NATO allies, to our European allies, right? Because the U.S. under Obama and with John Kerry as the lead negotiator had been so key to getting to the point that Paris was formalized, that it was agreed, right? And of course, the U.S. as a major industrial power is so vital to the global effort for climate change. You can't really have global climate change without the U.S. So it was disorienting and discouraging to see the administration do that. But not long after that, we saw similar moves with regard to the Iran nuclear deal, where the U.S. abrogated, walked away from the deal. We saw in the Pacific the Trump administration decide not to proceed with the free trade agreement we would have been the 12th member of that agreement, a trade agreement in the Pacific. So there's a number of things now, a number of cases where this administration has walked away. And every case has been, in varying degrees, important to our European allies. So it's very disconcerting. And for them, it's evidence that they can't really trust a commitment made by the United States under this administration.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email info@harbertv.com.
Safely stop fires around your home. Introducing the Fire Ice XT 20-ounce aerosol canister. Fire Ice XT is an eco-friendly water-based fire suppressant gel. Unlike a traditional fire extinguisher, Fire Ice XT is a highly effective, non-toxic firefighting agent that is easy and safe to use around your home, family, and pets. Available at Amazon.com or call 800-924-4874.
I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. Find us on Facebook to get all the latest updates, see behind-the-scene photos, and make comments and ask me questions. You can see episodes before their TV broadcast, so like the show today. I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. I very much would like to hear from you about the program, so please send me an email with your thoughts. You can suggest what topics I should cover, what guests I should invite to be on the show, or even what specific questions you would like me to ask. This is your program, so send your suggestions to aaron@harbortv.com. I promise to personally read every one, so email me today. And most of all, thanks for watching.
The Aaron Harber Show may be viewed 24/7 at no charge from any location in the world at harbortv.com.
And in your reference to climate change, I think one of the aspects of climate change I think the American people don't see and aren't aware of is the fact that the U.S. Department of Defense takes a very long-term view on preparation, availability, and has, as a result of that, for a number of years, addressed climate change in its planning. Talk about, and I don't know what your involvement is, but I'd be interested in your being able to articulate the department's viewpoint and how it integrates issues related to climate change into its military planning.
So in the long run procurement cycle, so when the Defense Department is imagining what will the Navy ships of the future look like, or aircraft, or even ground vehicles, transport and so forth, right? There's a deliberate effort to take into account that fossil fuels are not only damaging to the environment, but the sources of fossil fuels may be at risk. And so if we were to build an Army, Navy, Air Force based on free availability of those resources, which happen to be damaging to our to the climate, we would also be putting at risk national security. So there is a deliberate effort to research and develop more efficient uses of energy, alternative uses of energy. So for example, in some remote places in Afghanistan where we, in the past years, have had troops scheduled, the bases are powered by solar. Why? Well, we could put diesel generators there, but it's very inefficient and very expensive to provide electrical power via diesel in the Hindu Kush region of Afghanistan, very remote, desolate region. So it makes sense not only because of climate, but it also makes sense of just in terms of military efficiency. And I'd like to think that the Department of Defense is one of the leaders among U.S. government agencies and departments in exploring alternatives, which are both more efficient but also more climate friendly.
I want to talk more about climate change in a little while, but I want to kind of wrap up on NATO. One of the concepts, of course, is, and certainly this president has been heavily promoting, to put it politely, the concept that all NATO members should be dedicating 2% of their GDP, their gross domestic product, to military expenditures. Where are we in that process? How realistic is that? And what does that really mean?
So actually, first of all, this is, in this interview, the first time that I can tell you that I actually agree with President Trump and this administration. NATO allies do need to step up. And so today there are 29 members of NATO. I think that by last count, only 8 of the 29 have reached that magic 2% of GDP level committed to their defense budgets. So these are national defense budgets. Of course, the U.S. is one of those 8. But 8 of 29 is not an overwhelming number. So he's right. The president's right. NATO allies do need to step up. But he's not exactly right on several other counts. First of all, they took this commitment. Allies took this commitment before he declared his candidacy for president. He took this under Barack Obama in 2014. Why 2014? Because in the first 6 months of 2014, you had in quick succession the Russian seizure of the Crimean Peninsula, a sovereign piece of Ukrainian territory, followed a couple months later by the destabilizing of eastern provinces of Ukraine proper, right? And Russian troops are still there, okay? Followed a couple weeks later by the downing of MH17, the Malaysian airliner, where some 300 people were killed, and we now know they were downed by a Russian air defense system based in eastern Ukraine.
Right, with the help of Russian expertise.
No question, there's no question. It was a Russian system, and I frankly don't believe that the Russians trained their Ukrainian proxies in a short period of time to run this sophisticated system. I believe logic points to this was a Russian move. And then now, of course, several Russian individuals have been indicted by Dutch officials as a result of this. And then the third or fourth key event here was that a guy by the name of al-Baghdadi, the head of the so-called Islamic State, went into the main mosque in Mosul, northern Iraq, and declared the caliphate, which spanned across northern Syria and northern Iraq. So in 6 months, you had 1, 2, 3, 4 moves. In September of 2014, NATO leaders came together in the UK for a routine summit, a meeting of the NATO leaders. President Obama was in the chair for the US, and those are the events that account for the fact that the allies have agreed to move to 2%. So there's sometimes debate in Washington. I live in Washington. There's sometimes debate in Washington. Which president, the debate goes, is responsible for 2%? Some will say, well, it's President Trump. You know, I mean, he's the one who's been sort of yelling at the allies. Others will say, no, you're behind in your reading. It was Obama who got the leaders to agree. Actually, I think it was another president, Putin, who was responsible for the 2% pledge. And the key here is that NATO allies do need to step up. There has been progress. We're in the 4th consecutive year since the pledge was taken of real increases across the alliance. And when you separate out the US and you sum up those increases across those 4 consecutive years, it's about 80 or 90 billion dollars of additional defense spending from our European allies. So my sense is they got the message. They're continuing to get the message with President Trump. But candidly, I don't think his messaging technique is constructive. And here's why. When he denigrates allies publicly and repeatedly, so think Angela Merkel as an example, right? It doesn't make it easier for Angela Merkel to go home to Berlin, go before the Bundestag, her parliament, and make the case that the parliament should appropriate and approve increased German defense spending. In fact, in my view, it makes it more difficult. It makes it politically untenable for Angela Merkel in this instance to make that case. Now, she's still a strong leader, but my point is that politics at the international level eventually boil down to politics inside a parliament or inside a Congress where monies have to be appropriated. And the kind of lambasting, yelling at allies in public that we've seen by this president, in my view, is not conducive to the kind of moves we need to see in national capitals.
So when we come back in part 2, I want to talk a little bit more about our relationship with Russia and certainly kind of the split, as it were, the schizophrenic type of relationship we have with the president and seeming to have one relationship and almost everyone else looking at Russia quite differently. So
Great.
We'll do part 2 in a minute. Make sure you stay tuned for part 2 with General and Ambassador Douglas Lute. I'm Aaron Harber. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Please contact us. We want to hear from you. And thanks for watching.